Hello, everyone. I'm very excited for our morning program where we're here with one of my great friends, Marlene. Marlene has been a sign language interpreter for many years, and we have worked together for a long, long time. I've always been impressed with Marlene's level of theory around interpreting. So that's one of the reasons that we brought her on to talk to the astrologers about translation theory. Hi, Marlene. How's your day going?
Hi, happy Sunday.
Nice. How long have you been a sign language interpreter?
Since 1988.
Okay. That's a long time. Do you enjoy it?
Yes, yes, very much so.
Okay. So let's just get right into this. Now, I'm going to be asking you a lot of hard questions. And the first one is, are all texts equally hard to understand or easy to understand, and why or why not?
That's an interesting question. Thank you. Um, Let me start by saying something very general about the difference between translation and interpreting. In interpreting, I'm in a situation either in person or remotely where I have some sense of context. I know what era we're living in. I know um, something about who's hosting this meeting, what the goals, some of the goals, people have different goals, but there's a very clear context. And then all of the translation piece of the interpreting work, which includes doing a lot of things that help people get connected, um, uh, who, especially those who might not be accustomed to interpreting. It helps move the conversation along. So the context is front and center. In translation, the text is all frozen and decontextualized, at least to some degree, and sometimes to a great degree. And the older the text, the more decontextualized it is. So, what was happening in that era? What are the ways that people use these same words that we might use now that have an entirely different meaning back then? So, in translation, we have to do the work as translators to discover that context, because we can't really know what words mean if we don't understand the context in which they were used.
Hmm. Interesting.
Does that help?
Absolutely. Well, when translating the Vedic Phalanx anthology, I read a bunch of books in ancient Greek to get that contextual stuff. I read the Bible in ancient Greek. I read several other things to try to understand what's going on in general. Now, I think I would have been a better translator if I was also a historian, having really studied the history of ancient Greece, and that would have been giving myself contextualization, right? Okay, so then I love that context piece. So then let's get to the heart of the question also, which is, are some texts harder to understand? Like, let's say you have all the context. Are some texts harder or not?
Well, of course, some texts are harder than others. If I was trying to translate something that was a text on nuclear physics and I know nothing about nuclear physics, it would be impossible. I can't do it. It's not a possible task. So the idea that any translator, any individual translator can translate anything is a false idea. And that idea exists very prevalently in the interpreter world. So you mentioned in the beginning that I am very much rooted in theory. So I'll say a little something about that now, because this one idea shaped my work more than almost anything else, and I think it leads to the kind of conversations that we have. So I read a book by a Swedish Russian interpreter who did community interpreting, which in the spoken language interpreting world is considered less than, as compared to like conference interpreting at the UN, or international meetings of governmental kinds of people. Anyway, so she did her PhD, and I won't tell you the whole story, but she gathered all this data first before she looked for a theory that fit that data. And what she found was the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. And what Bakhtin said was, words in and of themselves have no meaning. There's no inherent meaning in any word. Words, meaning exists in people, and words are carriers of our agreements with other people about how we're going to talk about something, so we can have a conversation. So, simple things like I remember the first time my teenage son said to me, "Oh, that's sick." And I'm like, "Don't say that. This is very nice." He's like, "No, Mom, now sick means so great." I'm like, "Oh, that's like in the 50s when people said, 'Oh, he's so bad.'" Right? Those are simple examples. We have all kinds of slang examples. We have all kinds of tech examples. We have all kinds of words that have been appropriated from the three-dimensional world into the tech world. And over time, just the meaning of words changes. And one time I was watching one of the first interviews Bob Dylan ever gave, because he did not like to talk about his work. I think he still doesn't, but he was silent about his work for years. And I think it was 60 Minutes he let give an interview. And the interviewer, which was Ed Bradley, asked him, what do the words in this song mean? And he just looked at me, goes, "Well, words today don't mean the same thing they did then." Like, what a ridiculous question. So it really cemented for me that the meaning of words in everyday use or in a live context where people are speaking or signing, that's more clear. But when we're talking about the printed page, of course, those agreements are more concrete, I want to say. Maybe that's not the right word. But there is more of an established sense of what words mean in the printed context. So when the farther away we get from a text, I think the harder it is. So that's one of the reasons I was so impressed when you were translating this ancient Greek, because I'm like, how would I do that? It's so much work to get that contextualization, to get the actual understanding of what those words are pointing to, because it's pointing us to something.
That's interesting you say that. In the introduction of the Tetrabiblos, which was the first book I translated, I remember having to make an introduction to the Greek cosmology in order to actually release the translation part of the text. It's like, this is how the Greeks saw the cosmos, and this is, how they were looking. Now you can read the book. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, is like, we had to add contextualization before the reader could even get into the source text. So we did handle that, I think, especially in that text. Yeah, it makes me think maybe we should have done that in every text. I think we do what we need to do in order to render the text faithfully so that the reader has an equivalent experience to when we read it in Greek, right? Like, so we have to add, sometimes footnotes are a thing, sometimes an intro is a thing, or a forward, or so there are ways to do that in written text.
And I love that you talk about that practical tension between adding enough context to make it more, the translation, useful, but not adding so much that somebody looks at it and says, like, "Well, I'm not a linguistic scholar, this is not helpful," right? The finding that sweet spot for a translator of how do I make this translation maximally available to the reader? And that's a balancing act, like you're talking about.
Well, and that's such a good point, because I think that depends on our target audience, right? Like, who is reading the text. If we were writing the book for linguistic scholars, we would want to add as much of this beefed up stuff because that's what they like, and but if it's just for the layman astrologer, not layman, but what I mean, the just the astrologer who's not a theorist in linguistics, then we just want to add just enough to get them into the astrological part of the book. And so yeah, I think target audience, I guess when we're sign language interpreting, we do that. We know who we're interpreting to, and so how we interpret, like, we have this problem in sign language interpreting when we do air guitar. Okay, what is air guitar and why is that hard?
Well, let me go back just a little bit, and I want to say that I resonate deeply with what you just said. And Danica Seleskovich, who was the grand dame of the French School of International Interpreting, which again is the conference interpreting in the back of the room in a booth with a microphone, she said she had 3 requirements for an accurate translation. And the third, I always forget what the first 2 are, because they're, like it has all the meaning in there, whatever. Those things that we know well. But the third one that she named way back in the 70s was, it must be geared to the recipient. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Wow.
Yes. Who am I talking to? So there's there's a tendency to think when we're going to have a book and it's going to be frozen on the page that we're not in conversation. But we are always in conversation, and that awareness of who are we in conversation with really informs the translation. And your example was perfect for that. Yeah. So air guitar. So for people who don't know, when I get called to interpret something and there's no deaf person present, but the people who have hired me to be there would like me to still go ahead and interpret, even though there's nobody identified. So I don't find that difficult. I know many interpreters struggle with that, and I don't, for a couple of reasons. One is I don't know everybody's hearing status in that room. I don't know that many times. And oftentimes that happens when it's a public event. And of course, the event organizers did the right thing to hire an interpreter and make sure it was accessible. And oftentimes today, which I really appreciate, they don't require people to out themselves. Who needs the interpreter? Oh, you have to sit over here. No, they can sit wherever they want. They don't have to identify themselves. And I don't know. I don't know if anybody there, that's in a large event. Now, it's sometimes with smaller events, I might know nobody needs it, but most often air guitar is, or, I like to call it symbolic interpreting, because what the purpose of, okay, so what's the function of interpreting? To facilitate a communication between people who don't share a language. I like to think of myself as a doorway. So there's a door between them, and I open the door. I'm the doorway, and then they could talk to each other, right? That's a best case scenario. So what is the function of me being there? It's to show people what the right thing is to do. It's to affirm that we are committed to inclusivity. Like, those are very important values to reinforce, and to say, again, going back to, like, you don't have to self-identify. We're going to do the right thing, and we're not going to single people out. Right. So I'm okay with air guitar. But what it means is I can't gear my interpretation to the recipient, which feels awkward. And until I did it a bunch of times, it was uncomfortable. But my way of dealing with that is to say to myself, oh, today I get an opportunity to work on something. What would I like to work on in my interpretation? Would I like to work on giving myself more time before I get started? Because there's nobody sitting there waiting for each word that gets said. Or, like, I want to work on discourse markers. And so today, I'm not going to worry about details, right? So if it's just symbolic interpreting and nobody's going to watch it, I'm getting paid to have fun and work on myself. So it's paid professional development in my mind. So I probably might be in the minority, but I don't mind interpreting when I don't know if anybody's receiving that message. It does add a layer of complexity that it's like, but I'm okay with it.
Well, and I agree with you. I don't have any problem with air guitar, but the reason there's a name for it is because a lot of interpreters do struggle with it. I call it ubiquitous voice, where, and same when I Facebook, right? When people have a hard time Facebooking, and I say, I just speak to the ubiquitous voice of, like, what does the whole group want to hear? There is a receiver. The whole group at once is a receiver. So I do think, and there might be more expansion, when we're interpreting, we might stop and expand a little bit more, because to make sure that everyone in the room would be still caught up with the message, like, depending on your generation or your hearing style or whatever. So, I do think it does inform how we render the message. It's just, it doesn't stress me out either. Yeah. So I like.
Yeah. I like that ubiquitous voice. That's really nice. I'm going to keep that.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, I'm going to keep a lot of what I learned today. That's for sure. From you. Okay. Are you ready for the next question? I love listening to you talk. This is so refreshing. Okay. What do you do if you don't understand the text? Now, there's two different options here. One is when you can consult the person, and one is when you can't consult the person. So what do you do when you don't understand?
So just a caveat, I have never translated into a written form anything that I didn't understand. So my experience comes out of simultaneous interpreting. And that's a little bit different than text, which we've already talked about. But in my experience as an interpreter, I taught this 1 week seminar on what technical interpreting, what can I do when I don't understand? So
Asking the
I'm
right person.
when interpreting into ASL, and that was the most common time, like if I don't know what a deaf person is talking about, I'm not going to do that job. I'm going to turn that down, first of all, because the deaf people are from a marginalized community, and any misrepresentation that I give will be ascribed to the deaf person almost universally. And there's some interesting research. Stephanie Fain did a fascinating study of hearing people's perception of deaf people based on the interpreter performance. And all the errors were always ascribed to the deaf person, never to the interpreter. So I think the the hearing world has some kind of idea that if you put an interpreter there, everything they did was 100% accurate, which couldn't be farther from the truth. But anyway, so taking that off the table, when I'm working in tech environments, and I'm not a techie person, I'm an academic, but I can code switch to some degree, and I do a lot of tech right now. I listen for nouns and verbs, because the way nouns function in ASL is they have a place in 3-dimensional space. So if I can identify what's a noun, I can put it somewhere, and then I have visual integrity of my message, and it stays there throughout the conversation, whether I understand what it is or not. And then there's a limited number, relatively, of ASL verbs, and then there's a limitless ways that they can be oh gosh, the word just skipped out of my mind. I'm getting old. Changed. The way that all kinds of meaning can get added to those verbs, but there's a limited number of base verbs. And so what are the verbs? Are you transforming something? Are you shifting something? Are you dropping something? Are you raising? Like, there's just not that many, right? And so if I can listen, so really for me in simultaneous interpreting, it goes back to how am I listening? And so I can think in text, I could use that concept of how am I reading this? What is my filter on this? Because we always have a filter, and it's important to know what our filter is. Now, if I have a ton of content knowledge, I don't have very much filter except my own emotional self, or like maybe my opinions or my feelings about the content. But when I don't know the content, the filter is my lack of context. So then it's nouns and verbs. And then if I'm live with people, it's adjusting based on how they respond. Do they ask me for clarification? Do they feed me a sign or something, like they understand what's being said and I don't? So I'm very much in partnership with people. And there's a word that's used differently by some various people, but Molly Wilson's idea of open process. So often we think of the translator or the interpreter as the expert, when in fact they might have the least expertise of anyone in the room, which is very ironic. And so if I open up my process, and simply by making space, making time, stopping what I'm doing for a second and giving an ASL invitation to inform me, then the people become my partner in the interpretation. So I don't own it solely. So those two things, nouns and verbs, and then being in partnership with people on both sides of the interpretation. I
Fascinating.
don't know if that's helpful.
Oh yeah, this is all great. So what if you're interpreting for a hearing person and you didn't understand what they said, like they mumbled or something?
Well, it again, context is everything. And when I was in my interpreter training program in 1987 and 88, our program used to always say CIE, context is everything, and it was kind of the answer to most questions. So, what is the relationship between the deaf people here and these hearing people? If it's an unequal situation where the hearing person has some kind of power over the deaf person, then I wouldn't necessarily ask for clarification. I would use non-manual markers, which are a way of asking a question without, people misunderstand. They think sign language is all on your hands, but really the most important thing is your face. So you can have a whole conversation without ever lifting your hands up. So I might say, I didn't hear that. And so that gives the deaf person an opportunity to tell me, oh, ask them to repeat it or just drop it.
Oh.
So again, I'm in partnership in the interpretation. If a fire truck is going by, I tell people the environmental noise that's happening. A fire truck is going by, and maybe the person keeps talking, but nobody in the room really heard what they said very well. And I'll give them what I got, something about blah, blah, blah. They're like, whatever. Or they're like, no, I need to know that. So, yeah.
Well, it's similar
Yeah.
in the written translation. Sometimes I'm like, did they spill coffee on the papyrus here? Because there's something mumbled here. Like, so sometimes you're translating and it's just not clear, or maybe in the rendering or the critical edition they made a mistake or something like that. So sometimes I've had to learn to use footnotes, which is that kind of non-manual marker of saying like,
Yes.
This is Andrea Gehrz. This part of the text was not clear. I did my best with but I am not clear on the meaning of this portion because I want to make sure they know it's the translator, not, I don't want them to take for face
Yes.
value so that is kind of that meta moment where we say like, I don't know if I understood that. Yeah, I think it's
Or
different.
this is the way I understood it, I think. But
Right.
but
Yeah, and
you
I think
use your wisdom. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think that I like that we agree that that's something that kind of needs to be handled if you don't understand it. Like, with Valens, it took me 12 to 15 years to understand what he said. I had to go and read all these texts on teleology, which are, I went to this History of Science convention and went to these teleology lectures because they kept talking about telos. This telos is doing a thing, and I was like, what is a telos? Like, so I couldn't even understand what he was saying for 12 years, and so I never quite wrote it down, because I was still trying to grok the message. But yeah, I think once the meaning really washed over me and I got the chunk, then I felt comfortable writing it down. But then still there was passages where, like I said, there's something muddled or weird about the rendering to the critical edition that wasn't clear. And it's cool because we have a few translations to compare nowadays because one was released online open source. And so that's cool. That's like having a team, in team interpreting where we like lean over to our team and like, did you get that? And like having this other translation functions that way, which is really nice. Would you ever lean over to your team and ask if they got it?
Well, again, back to that word open process. And I should say too, some people call that kind of behavior that I just described as co-navigating. So we're navigating the conversation together. I'm navigating it with the deaf person where they're giving me their directions because after all, it's their life. I'm a guest there.
Yeah.
But I practice open process with team interpreters to the extent that other people are comfortable doing that. Not everyone is comfortable. So it's kind of a wise person once told me every relationship is based on the least common denominator. The person who wants the least in the relationship sets the bar, right? So if my team doesn't want to look at me, doesn't want to be supportive, doesn't want me to look at them, that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end is open process. And I try to be down there as much as I can. Sometimes it takes working with somebody a bunch of times before they feel comfortable because there are critical people out there who just go off on everybody and nobody likes being the target of that. And people have been hurt. So I understand, like, I'm good. I'll just do my turn. You do your turn. I get that. But my preference is this open process. And so I invite that at the beginning of the work. And then I invite how I would like to be supported. I call it support. And that's what I feel it is for me. So if I'm working with someone face to face and I lean over like this, they know from my body language, like, I'm not sure. And if they're listening carefully and say I'm working from ASL to English, they can hear what I've said that's not as clear as it could be. And they're going to feed me just a little something. And then I'll weave it into my interpretation. Or if it's a quick conversation where people are going back and forth, my preference is the other person, like if they feed me something and the whole room can hear what they just said, and then I say the exact same thing. Why? What is that? Oh, because it's my turn. They're not really speaking, but everybody can hear them. So in that kind of open process, if they just speak the part that they understood that I didn't, then I go back to being the primary interpreter at that moment. So yeah, I want other people to help me make um, each part of my interpretation as sound as it can be,
Yeah.
as complete and clear as it can be.
Okay, I need to say something about open process and written translation. So there is an option to do open process with the Vedic Valence text, and there's this forum. It's called the Skyscript forum, and there are all these Hellenistic astrologers
What's
on
it called? I'm sorry. What's it
It's
called
called
again?
the Skyscript forum.
Oh, the Skyscript form. Okay, that was an unfamiliar word. And I have a little bit of hearing loss myself, so I just missed
Oh,
that word.
well, that
Thank
was
you.
a moment where you didn't understand the text, and that's
Yeah,
because it was a technical term that that you wouldn't have known. So
yeah.
so in this forum, there's a lot of Hellenistic astrologers, and what I could do is in points where there are pinch points in the translation, I could take it to the forum and say like, what do you guys know about this piece of the text? And then take their information. Like there was one point where I made a mistake, and I found out I made a mistake because there was a difference in the two translations, and then we put it out to the Skyscript forum, and someone came back with an answer, and I was like, oh, if I was going to make another edition of this translation, I would include that in my translation. And the idea that this translation should be perfect, like translation is an imperfect art, right? Like that's why you need a team and an open process and all these things. And so I have considered doing an open process with the astrologers at large to get a definitive translation of Valens. I don't know that I,
And can I just add that that is the only way to get a definitive translation is through collaboration. That's the only way. No single person can produce alone. I mean, somebody can say that they can, and you could argue that point, but I say no. Professionally, my opinion is no, you can't.
no, I agree with you because it takes a lot of information and context from a lot of people to really get a group approved translation, and that's because there's so many different receivers to that same text. And I agree with you. I mean, I think I'm learning from your point on the least common denominator. I just don't think I have time to do open process because I'm busy teaching and everything like that. But and I don't know that it would be worth it to try to make a definitive translation since we have three translations available. I think it's in some ways better for people to compare them themselves. But see how that's equivocal, kind of.
Well, I think what you're talking about is people's perception of what translation is. And I 100% agreed with you. Whenever I meet interpreters anew, I always say, well, simultaneous interpreting is an inherently flawed process. We'll just start with that, right? Like
Yes.
that's just a fact. And any single person doing a translation has a single point of view. And there's always other points of view that can be equally valid. And the only way you would get to something definitive is to bring all those other positions and sets of background knowledge and sensibilities and so many things, bring it all together. But right, is that kind of activity a high value use of your time? Because if there's various translations and people footnote, well, but I think I mean maybe this is a question you can answer. I mean, can't you do a translation and then do an updated edition from what you've learned? Like, why not just update your own edition, incorporating it?
Yeah, that's
I
what
don't
we
know.
did on Vedic Valens book one. We made a second edition about 10 years later because of everything we'd learned by going through book four. And then we're like, oh, we're going to go back and do this here. But like, I actually want to extrapolate this to a context of ASL interpreting. Like, what if we had a deaf person as president and they were making a State of the Union address? We would want to get some kind of voice interpretation that was definitive. Like, what would be the process there?
So I've had a number of deaf friends that gave TED Talks that were very high visibility TED Talks. And in every instance, so I just want to say that there is no world where deaf people can be monolingual. To a greater or lesser degree, you can read the bus sign, you can read the instructions on your cereal box, the ingredients on your cereal box, or the instructions on, how to do things, whatever. So they're bilingual already, and anyone who has risen to that kind of a position has usually a very good command of English. So my experience dealing with people in very high visibility positions like that is they produce the transcript of their own talk.
Oh.
And then what the interpreter is doing is not actually interpreting as delivering the talk at the same time.
Oh
So
my
it's being
gosh.
delivered. Yeah, it's being delivered at the same time in spoken English and in ASL. But the deaf person made those word choices, and what the interpreter is doing as they watch the deaf person is they're clocking where they are in the text. Oh, now I'm to this part. Okay, now I'm to this part. So you want to be in sync with the person delivering it in ASL, but you need to be following. They then have agency to choose their own words, and some of those words I wouldn't choose, and I would go, that was smart. I wouldn't have thought of that. And some I would be like, yeah, I wouldn't say it that way, but it's then their personality that
Yeah.
comes through.
Well, you just solved a big question for me because I kept thinking about that. Like, how would they make a definitive translation? It has to come from the same message sender, basically, if it was really going to be the translation. Okay. Um, wow. Okay. So we might have to have you back for a second episode. This is so good. Okay. Do you compete with your teammates? Because I'm asking this because in the Hellenistic astrology world there is this kind of, or there was for years, a kind of competition between translations of like which translation of Valens is better and things like that. And it's like I think I got sucked into that of like, oh, which is better, but I don't know that we do that in sign language interpreting. Like I don't know that we compete with each other. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think it happens.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't. I don't, but there's such a demand for interpreters that the skill level of interpreters, and I just want to make a side note for people who are not familiar with our world. Most interpreters that work between ASL and English are not native to ASL. It's learned much later in life, usually in high school at the earliest, or college is very common. And so we never have native fluency. You cannot have native fluency when you've begun your learning that late. And when it's only your second language, I see people who, when it's their third or fourth language, they have a more neuroplasticity for learning language. But we had a good friend that we worked with who grew up speaking Armenian in English. She was a fantastic interpreter, even though she learned later in life. Anyway, uh, Tina. So oh yes, interpreters do compete with each other, and there's a pettiness to it. And there are people who are in this field not because they want to be great translators, because they went to college and they said, do I want to do accounting or do I want to do interpreting? And they're not part of the deaf community, they're not part of the culture, and it's just a job for them. And they don't have any authentic connections to deaf people. And whatever language they learned in college, which is already a fossilized version of the language because it's academic language, not the whole broad spectrum of how people use language. And then that's their measuring stick. So they've learned this one way, they've learned a kind of a stilted version of the language, and I've seen them criticize deaf people for how they sign, or native signers, whatever, which is very arrogant. And yes, and they critique each other. And oftentimes, if an interpreter is especially skilled, what I see is they have to be especially humble so as not to hurt the feelings of the other interpreters. And God forbid, don't talk about the work until they express an interest in talking about the work.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
if I go in and start talking because I'm very analytical, I want to, oh, like, where did you learn that? Or did you think about doing that? It's like, I'm interested in the work, but I think there's this tendency of people to not be able somehow to separate who they are from their work. It's all one thing. And until you get that separation, it's very difficult to talk about the work.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons you and I have always enjoyed working together is that we are both very theoretical about the work. Like we like to meta analyze how the translation went. And I really don't think in my old age that I'm competitive with my teams at all. Like I'm functioning at a level where, we are all good enough to get the job done. I mean, I haven't had a team, because I guess I'm working only at home and it's like you have to be pretty good to work from home. It's like, um, I think some of that maybe that competition comes on out of frustration when you have a team who's not quite getting the message. That can be stressful, when oh.
I don't touch that.
What do you do with that if you're
Nothing. I've learned to do nothing. If they have not, if I've talked with them beforehand or they won't talk to me beforehand, I already know that they don't want to collaborate like that. They just want to take turns. They did not invite me in to be supportive of them, then I'm not going to say anything. I learned to keep my mouth shut from
oh,
getting people upset with me. So, what I might see as supportive, they might see as criticism. And I don't know them well enough to know if I don't have a relationship with a person, I don't say anything.
yeah.
But if I know someone well, we'll be like, ooh, this is this kind of an event, and what can we work on, and what kind of support do you like, that kind of thing. But I think my sense of competition, I don't feel that I'm in competition with them, but oftentimes I get pushback from people that they, if I'm interested in, I'm a diagnostician, I'm interested in the work in an analytical way. And if I start doing that with people who haven't agreed to that, it's not usually, then they feel like I'm being in competition with them when I don't feel like I am. So I've learned to stay in my lane.
That's really interesting because I feel like I do find a curiosity about comparing the different translations of Valens, and I think it's sometimes taken like what you're saying is like that I'm comparing like which one is the best, and I'm like, can in my mind I'm like they're all the best. We're playing co-op, not versus. Like we're co-oping, trying to figure out what Valens said, and like, but it looks like a comparison of which is better, and it's like. I mean, I have to say I'm growing and I'm getting older and like I'm learning a lot from this conversation and where I'm like, okay, maybe if I start comparing them, we have to look at it as like it might be seen as a critique, you know. There are times though that I do want to compare them because I don't know, sometimes there's an interesting comparison. Like, let's talk about hermeneutic tension, which is a
Okay.
term that you taught me. And it really explains one thing that I am comparing is my translation was critiqued for being a lot longer than the other translation. And I was trying to explain why that is because there's something we call explicitization in translation, where if a concept is not easily rendered, like you have to add some context to make it make sense. Or what, so I did a lot of explicitization and things like that. And so, what is hermeneutic tension?
Okay, I'll back up just a little bit and give you another one of my theorists. So in 1979, this brilliant guy named Michael Reddy wrote a paper on let's see, basically saying that the conduit model is infused in English. I forget the exact, I'm getting older. I'm forgetting exact words of things sometimes. But it's the conduit model of English, because English has embedded in it the idea that communication is a conduit. That is one way of seeing communication. And that is inherent in how we talk about it. Like, I have an idea, I think of it, I say something, I give it to you, you receive it, you think about, it's like that's a conduit. Okay, so that's embedded in our thinking by our language, but it's only one way to see things. And so I think it's a good background thing to just be aware of, that we're already, our own language frames how we're thinking about these things. So what is hermeneutic tension? Any word, we've already talked about words in and of themselves don't have any concrete, solid, unmovable meaning. But we have very broad agreements where they do have a pretty static meaning, mostly. So we kind of use words like one person I know who teaches interpreter says words are like a little suitcase. You open the suitcase, you take the meaning out, and you get a suitcase from the other language and you put it in. I couldn't disagree more. Right. But that kind of idea that you could just extract the meaning out of the word and put it in a new word is a false idea. So what hermeneutic tension is, there's a superficial or surface level meaning of that word based on context that we're not acknowledging, but believing that this has an exact meaning, and it may be close, may still be the way the word is used. I mean, that happens all the time. But the tension between that kind of surface level meaning of the word and the in-depth or contextualize possible other meanings of that word, and then how to render that in a text, is the hermeneutic tension. So how much of that deeper meaning versus a superficial or surface meaning do I need in this translation? And that's the tension that we feel. It's like, okay, where am I going with this? And really each and every word in a text has that hermeneutic tension to some degree. And some words are really loaded and it's full of that hermeneutic tension. Do I go with the surface level meaning of what my understanding of that is now at this point in time, or do I look beneath that to all the implicit meaning that might exist and be the point of what's being said? So then you look at other words in the sentence, you look at bigger portions of the text, the paragraph, the chapter, whatever, to see if that guides you any. But that tension is the translator's tension between the surface meaning and the deeper and contextualized meaning.
Okay, a perfect example of this is in the first book of Vedic Founds, he talks about the planets having these flavors. So he says the flavor for Saturn is I can't remember the name for it, but one of the other translators just said astringent, or and they picked one word for the flavor, or like bitter, or like for the Mars flavor is picros, which they said was, I don't know, sharp or something.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's not, it's an ancient flavor. It doesn't actually exist in the modern day. Like, it's not just that one word. So the way we handled it was say Mars is the flavor of picros, sharp, bitter, pungent. It's like we put all the meanings from the dictionary into the book, which is why our translation is so much longer, because we believe that, okay, that flavor doesn't exist, and it needs, and it's not just bitter, it's not just sharp, it's all these things, like the
Right.
flavor of Saturn is like, it's like astringent, the kind to make you pucker up like this. And the energy of Saturn is to go inward like this. And so we thought, oh, it's not just bitter, that you don't get that feeling of, like, if you say bitter, we had to extrapolate out all the meanings. So is that an example of hermeneutic tension?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yes. You are solving problems over here for the astrologer, because I'm just like, what? And I got called crazy for my translation. They were like, she's crazy. She's adding all this meaning, like all this kind of stuff. And so I don't take this personally anymore. It took 15 years of them thinking I was crazy, though. So it did take a little bit of holding space for myself as a translator and theorist to know I'm not crazy, in this way anyway. I'm actually a theoretician who, and it's all my translator, ASL interpreter friends who kept me sane, because we're all talking about the translations in these theoretical ways. And, it's like I couldn't lean on the astrologers to help me with these tensions. I had to lean on my interpreter friends, because they were the ones who knew how to wrangle the translations. So.
Well, I can affirm that as someone who plays around the very edges of astrology and really enjoys having expert astrology friends like yourself and a couple other people, I find as someone reading who's a layperson in this field and is never going to be anything but, as far as I know, I don't have any aspirations to become the kind of professional or expert level that you have. I don't even know if I could. Having all those words allows me to find that sense inside my own body where I go, that you were talking about. And if it was just one word, so I'm just affirming. I would, my preference is always for a contextualized or more complete translation. I know other people have different feelings and they want it. We live in a world where, if your sentence is more than 8 words long, people get turned, like everybody's on their phones and
Yeah,
everybody's
we're not making a tweet here.
Yeah, right, right. But I think our brains have now become acclimated to very short conversation or very, very short sentences, very short reading. And I think what I see in general in the world is that some people want to say the least amount of words they can possibly say to have the interaction or say the thing. It's a tweet world, and it's everywhere. And I find it challenging for me. Now, I think, the introverts who don't want to talk to people historically have had a rough time because the extroverts control the world. It's all about the relationships and the interactions, and you got to go be social and grow your network and blah blah blah. And that was rough for the introverts, but now they have they have a stake that I, especially since the pandemic, that I had never seen in my life, and I find it challenging. But I just kind of say, well, It was our turn before, it's their turn now. So
Mm.
I can see for some people being succinct has a certain kind of value that will speak to someone. And this goes back to your earlier point about, instead of having a definitive translation, to have different translations of the same thing, all of which are sound and reasonable from a different point of view. So somebody can read one translation, like I would probably be more attracted to yours because it's more robust. Somebody else might be like, oh, I can't with all that. I just want the thing, right? And so somebody else has done a translation that is more clean, more spare,
Right.
more minimalist. Then that will speak to somebody else. And that way everybody gets what they need. No right or wrong.
Right.
That's
That's definitely where I am in my old age, is like this translation's beautiful for these reasons. This one's beautiful for these reasons. And aren't they, isn't it so fun to look at them both, you know?
yes.
And by looking at both, you really get to the nugget of like what was the same in both of them. And it's cool because neither of us consulted each other. Like I didn't look at that translation when I was making mine. They both came from the Greek into these, you know, so it's really, you can, if there is a confusing part of the translation, it's nice to look over at the other one and say like, oh, it's confusing in this one too. So the Greek was confusing there. Like having
Mhm.
the two of them makes it just like, it's like having a team of interpreters. It really helps. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, it's like having a team of interpreters, having various translations. I'm all for it.
yeah, oh yeah, me too. Well, yeah, and I think in sign language interpreting, what's so cool about calling on the sign language interpreters to talk to the astrologers is that we we work in translation like 30 hours a week, and so we work with teams regularly. Like we constantly are having to translate. Like for us, this is like no-brainer stuff, but to written translators, this is like mind-blowing. They work in a silo, you know, basically in their department, just working alone on a translation for years, and that's just the style. I mean, it makes me imagine a world where a team would attack a written translation. I've never seen that, but I'm sure it happens.
Well, I'm sure it happens too. I've known a few people who were involved with Bible translation, which, you know, the Bible isn't my book, but for, I mean, in terms of translation, there's all that history there, and people reading it in the original languages and translating. And I have a friend whose brother I've never met is an academic, well-known scholar in Bible translation. And so he had a lot to talk to me about with interpreting based on what he learned early in his life from his brother's work. So I think there are some areas where a few texts have had a more deep variety of translations. But of course, you know, we got stuck with King James. But
Well, you know
but
why? You know why that is? You know, well, not like I know, but you know, here's one idea, is that there are linear texts and poetic texts. And in the linear text, you know, it's like one plus one
Mhm.
equals two is a linear text. Like when we interpreting that, like you and I would probably interpret that the same, like one plus one equals two. I mean, I can't really think of that many ways to translate that. It's a linear text. But a poetic text has a bunch of multiple meanings. Like a rap song has like when they use like double and triple meanings or triple entendres or things like that, or like even a spoken word poem, right? It's like how you translate in that and how I translate that are going to be vastly different because it's a poem, right? And there's all these style choices and it's got multiple meanings. That's what a poem does, is like conjure multiple meanings. And then we decide like, can I render this in a way that allows the deaf person to have multiple meanings extracted? Or like, do I have to choose one meaning because I can't come up with something? But I would say the Bible is closer to a poetic text than a linear text. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's not always well contextualized that way, but yes, very much so. It's a poetic text. I mean, we the whole book of Psalms is a book of songs, and then there's Song of Solomon, and I mean, there's so much that's even explicitly poetic. And
Yeah.
then there's a lot that's, yeah, it's very little of it is explicit.
Right. Well, it's interesting in the Vedas Fiala's book, he goes from poetic text to linear text. Like there's these mathematical portions where he's like, add up the years from Hadrian, now subtract 21. Like, and so in these it's like extremely linear. Like I'm basically making a math equation. Now I did have some, choices there with formatting. Like I really like our formatting because I make it like a math textbook where it's like one line per equation. And I think you can clarify in those ways. But then he goes into these poetic parts where he's talking about the signs and he's like, Scorpio's like this. And he's like, he's kind of a poet. And so it's like, I don't know. I think it's a really good example of a text that it could be section by section. Like, is this linear or poetic? It doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
And maybe Psalms is more poetic than Revelations or something like,
Or Genesis. I would offer that Revelations is highly poetic, but maybe Genesis, and on the third day, and on the fourth day, and on the fifth day, right?
Oh,
It's
interesting.
like,
Well, let's talk about okay, let's talk about wrongness and rightness of translation. So in poetic text, like let's take the Star Spangled Banner or something like that, which is kind of a poetic text because it's a song, right? But I want to talk about how there are translations that would be wrong. Like even though that we have 10 translation possibilities of even this one line in the Star Spangled Banner, how come there are some translations that would just be dead flat wrong? Like what is that?
well, that is a highly contextualized song. It's one person saying to another person in the battle, "Hey, the overnight the fighting stopped, but is the flag still there?" That's the whole thing, right? Like,
Okay.
oh, say, can you see? I'm asking someone, can you see the flag? Is it still there? Because last night the bombs were crazy. Is it still, did we hold them? That's what that
Wow.
song is. And then and then that's part one. And then part two is what that flag means, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Is it still there? So that's the more poetic part of what does that stand for. So we're having this fight, we're fighting for our country, our flag. Is the flag still there? Oh, thank God. And here's what that means, because that's why it's so important. So that's what the Star Spangled Banner is. That it almost never gets rendered that way, because when you're translating a song, I mean, one reason is you're translating a song, you don't have it's an issue of timing. You can't set up the whole scene. You can't set up the whole scene where you're having the war and then one soldier's asking another soldier from the American side. We don't have time for all of that. Where oh, say, can you see? Like, we're going, right? So then what do you do when you have to truncate that contextualization? And people handle that a lot of different ways. And like you say, a lot of people don't even understand what it means.
Yeah.
So,
It depends on what you're doing too. Like maybe you're working at a school where they have a set way they do that, and then it's your job to sign that frozen way so they can sign along. Like that actually changes your translation too. Like,
completely. Oh, say, can you see? Like, word for word, even if it's clunky and no one deaf would ever sign it that way.
right.
Because
Yeah,
so
then, but
I want to go. I want hang on one second. I just want to go back to Badensjö, which is Wadensjo with an umlaut. But
oh,
I met some Swedish women who tried to teach me how to pronounce it correctly. I have an English kind of approximation, Badensjö, because W sound like V in their language, like in many languages. Anyway, uh, uh, and now I just lost my train of thought about oh geez, this happens to me all the time now that I'm getting older. I contextualize myself right out of my point. We're talking about the Star Spangled Banner. Good grief. And contextualization. Oh well, maybe it'll come back to me.
okay. Well, okay. So let's talk about wrongness. Like, why can we have like 10 right translations but one wrong? So what if I stood up there and I said like orange, apples?
Oh, I thought of it. I thought of it.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. So what I learned out of that whole book, her book, Interpreting as Interaction, what I learned out of the whole book is that what I'm interpreting is not words, it's functions. I want you to accept my paperwork and put it in your system. I want to get a bus pass. I want to get my medication refilled. Like, what's the function? One good example I can think of is the Lord's Prayer. And you know, like at the end of a 12-step meeting, or often in church, the point of reciting the Lord's Prayer is unity. That's the function. And so I would sign the exact words in that order because everybody's doing those words together in the same moment. It's unity. That's the function. Now, somebody has a wedding and they have the Lord's Prayer sung. That's poetry. And now you do the whole big. So what the translation goes back to Seleskovich. It has to be geared to the recipient, but also to the setting. Right? What is the function of that utterance in that moment? Okay, sorry.
That's brilliant. No, I always think about that with theatrical interpreting. Like a lot of the interpreters get tripping on the words, and I'm like, your first job is to entertain, because the function of the interpreter on stage here is to be an entertainer. Like,
Yeah,
so you gotta like kind of gotta like let it all out or whatever. Like that's your first function. Okay, then the second function is getting these like sentential things right. But no, I totally hear you on that. So okay, we have 1 minute, but I want to say okay, so but there are wrong translations. Like you can have 10 right translations, but like if I stood up and signed orange apple pink pear, like instead of oh say can you see, that is a wrong translate, so when comparing translations we can have several right translations, but there are just flat out wrong translations.
correct. Correct. Yeah, 100%. We don't have time. I could give you some examples, but on another day or another time we could do examples of wrong translations. Yeah.
Well, Marlene, just to show you, we got through this many questions, and I still have all of these and all of these for you.
Ah,
So we
geez.
don't know how much time, it really depends on the least common denominator, which I guess would be you, because I definitely want to do another episode. So it's up to you.
Oh, I'd be happy to do another episode
Yeah,
if it's useful. I always like talking about these things.
it is so useful. I think the astrologers are learning so much from the having the interpreters around, and like we are translation theorists, and astrologers are wrangling translations, and so I think this is brilliant. And just thank you so much, Marlene, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Thank you for asking me. It was a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it.
All right, bye.
Okay.